Getting ready to begin. I want to warmly welcome all of you to the third of our speaker series, Polling and the 2020 Election, From Lessons Learned to New Trends. This is a series that's a collaboration between the Baltimore County and Baltimore City League of Women Voters with support from Enoch Pratt Library. I'm Judith Shagrin, a social worker and retired child welfare wonk, who is a very proud member of the Baltimore County League. So before we get started, I have to put a plug in for becoming a member of your local League of Women Voters chapter. I joined 2 years ago and have found it to offer a great way to be involved with like-minded women and men in a nonpartisan organization that shares my values about the importance of civic engagement, supporting our democracy, and the right to vote. And of course, the value of civic discourse in carrying out our goals. A link to find your local chapter is posted in the chat, or you can always Google League of Women Voters and up it will come. But enough about us. Oh, but before I say that, I want to give a shout out for our incredibly comprehensive voters guide, 411. It's a wonderful way to find information about candidates, where to vote, how to vote, and a wonderful accomplishment of our League of Women Voters. But enough about us. I want to extend an especially warm welcome and great appreciation to our speaker today, Dr. Mileah Kromer, the director of the Sarah T. Hughes Field Politics Center. Dr. Kromer oversees every aspect of the Goucher Poll, from constructing survey instruments to sampling, data analysis, and the development of survey methods. Dr. Kromer is also responsible for training interviewers and providing lab supervision along with teaching courses on American politics and research methods. Her research interests include public opinion, survey research methodology, and American state politics. But before we get started, some technical tips. We are recording the session and live streaming it. We have everybody muted, and we ask that you stay muted for the duration of the presentation. We have received some questions already by email, but you may, as is written in our chat, please feel free to include another question. We'll have lots of time, and I suspect we all have lots of questions. One of our members will be monitoring your questions for Dr. Kromer to answer at the end. And by now, many, if not most of you, are very familiar with Zoom. Whoever thought that Zoom, or did you remember your mask, would be part of our everyday language? Nonetheless, here we are. If you have questions about how to use it, you may also post them in the chat. Just a couple of tips: you can change your view in the upper right-hand corner. You can stop your video in the lower, or start it in the lower left-hand corner. And again, if you could please mute yourselves during the presentation so that we don't have background noises or dogs barking or phones ringing. All right, I think we are good to go. Dr. Kromer, if you would like to join us.
Hi, thank you so much. Should I get started or? Okay, great. I think I'm going to share my screen with everybody. I put together a brief presentation, and then I figure I left a ton of room at the end for some questions. So maybe I'll answer some of your questions during the presentation, but if not, I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you at the end. It won't take that long, I promise. Let me see here. Okay, I think that you can see it now, right? Right? Okay, good. Okay, great.
You need to full screen it.
Okay, yeah, hold on. Perfect. Okay. Again, thank you so much to the League of Women Voters, Baltimore City and Baltimore County for inviting me. I'm Mileah Kromer. I'm the director of the Sarah T. Hughes Field Politics Center at Goucher College, and I teach political science. If any of you are on Twitter, you can follow me on Twitter. It's at Mileah Kromer. So we're going to talk about polls today. Three easy, basic topics. I want to tell you what went wrong in 2016. This is the question I get the most. What went right in 2018, the year that everybody seems to forget, and then what pollsters expect to happen in 2020. So what went wrong and right in 2016? Here's what went wrong. So I think the most important thing that went wrong is our interpretation was off, and how the media and other sort of interpreted polls, particularly those swing state polls in the waning weeks of the 2016 election. So a lot of times people mistakenly lump together forecasters with pollsters. So a forecasting model takes into consideration polls, but other inputs. But they also consider sort of economic variables, some demographic variables, and some other what we would call fundamentals. And they create a probabilistic prediction of what will happen. Oftentimes in 2012, and when Nate Silver first started doing this, and in 2008, these are really kind of spot on accuracy. But in 2016, all those major forecasting models missed. So Nate Silver and 538 was predicting something like an 80% to a 75% chance that Hillary Clinton would win. Huffington Post pollster was even more bullish on it, and it turned out that Trump ended up winning. The problem was, of course, so then everybody immediately blamed the pollsters for missing it. So it was the pollsters who missed. Well, if you took a closer examination of a lot of the swing state polling in the waning weeks of 2016, what you actually saw was a unusually high percentage of undecideds, which I'll talk about in a second, but also that Trump had pulled those races for a lot of states within the margin of error. So at that point, once you get in that margin of error, it is really anybody's game. And that night just went really well for Donald Trump. Undecideds, Pew Research Center did this really fantastic post-election analysis where they resurveyed voters. And it turns out those undecided voters just broke really heavily for Donald Trump. So you had him, the momentum was on his side. He pulled it within the margin of error, and those undecided voters ended up voting for Trump. And the biggest problem that a lot of the state level polls that did miss in those key swing states weren't weighting by educational attainment. And hindsight is always 20/20, but when you look back, those non-college educated white voters made up a much larger share of the electorate than surveys were predicting. And that's because surveys tend to overestimate, at least before we started weighting by educational attainment. Surveys overestimated college educated voters, because college educated voters are just more likely to say yes to take a survey when called. So if you look back and at some of the key, can you see? Sorry. Sorry about that. I can't see any of you, so I'm just looking at my screen, so it's a little bit jarring. If you look back again, these are some, the Upshot did a really great post analysis of 2016, and it'll tell you exactly what was wrong. So not weighted by education and those undecided voters. But what went right, and this is what nobody wants to talk about. Nobody ever asked me what went right in 2016, but a lot of things did. National polling was right. So the national polls predicted that Clinton would win, and the overall national vote, and she did. And some of the state polls were accurate. And really, so the post-election Pew, and the mistakes that were made were really in terms of, they were historically similar. So the overall picture in 2016 looked a lot like previous election cycles in terms of the way that we predicted the vote share, or the margin of error, or the error associated with what the polls predicted and what that final outcome was. And so if you look at each of the individual states in 2016, you will see that, so Trump did consistently outperform, but the weighted error in the polls in those final 21 days showed that 2016's presidential polls were about as accurate on average as polls had been in the previous years. The thing is, of course, is that it only counts, you can miss, right? You can be off, but as long as you're off in the right direction. The problem was in 2016, a few of those swing states, people were off, and they were off in the wrong direction. In other words, they didn't predict the winner. So it seems to me like when nobody cares when you're off if you're off in the right direction. What about 2018? This is another question that I never get asked. It was a great year for polls in 2018. The average Senate poll was off by only 4.2 points. That's been the average historically is 5.2 points. And so Senate races were good. The same story for governors and the same story for the House. So polls accurately predicted that blue wave would come, and it did. But again, nobody ever wants to talk about 2018. They only want to remember 2016. So 2020, that's where we're at right now. And we have been inundated with polls. It's just a different story. We live in a different political reality right now than we did in 2016. There's three key factors I would point to. Foremost, there is the polls tell us that Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton have a different standing with the electorate. Biden is right now nationally, and that includes Republicans and independents. His favorability rating is what pollsters call above water. So he is viewed more favorably than unfavorably. That was never the case for Hillary Clinton. And a majority of Americans are frustrated or angry about the direction of the country. No wonder with the coronavirus. And Trump is no longer, it's no longer an open seat race. He is the president of the United States with a direction of the country that most people view negatively. So he will get pulled down by that as an incumbent. There's also some clear trends underneath those national polls. If you look at the Trump coalition that helped him win in 2016, there's a lot of trouble there. Older voters are breaking for Biden. He's obviously doing better with white voters than Hillary Clinton was doing, and he is starting to capture a larger share of the independent vote. And I think the biggest indicator of trouble for Trump and part of the Trump coalition that helped him, that he pieced together in 2016, are suburban women. So suburban women are breaking towards Biden or moving away from that voting Republican, and it's going to cause problems for Donald Trump, and it's also going to cause problems sort of down ballot. And it's important, I think, to note that pollsters have improved. So pollsters and survey professionals like me took a long, hard look at the mistakes that were made in 2016, and we wanted to make things better. The first thing that I did with the Goucher College poll is I started weighting by educational attainment. We took again, a long, hard look at what was wrong and tried to fix it. There's also been an investment in statewide polling. And so for these larger forecasting models to work correctly, they have to have good input. And so you'll see folks like Nate Cohn and the New York Times have spent money to poll these key swing states. Monmouth University and some of the other big players in national polling have invested a lot of money to frequently poll states that might be in play. So we've never seen in the past so many polls of Georgia than we do right now. And there's also been some research on mixed method approaches to reaching respondents. Young people are hard to get on the phone. And so you see some organizations that have worked, that do a mix between phone and internet, or they'll do a text message to push to internet to try to capture a younger part of the electorate that is not as accessible by even cell phones as their older counterparts are. And then, so if you look at, the question is, okay, so how do the 2020 Battleground polls stack up to 2016? And what we see here is that if you look at the final vote versus how much Biden is up in some of these areas like Maine, Minnesota, Wisconsin, he is up in a lot of ways significantly than the final vote count between Clinton and Trump was in 2016. This is a great, I pulled this, a Real Clear Politics put together this chart. I can't take credit for it. So it was, if you want to Google it, I don't know how well it shows on your screen, but I'm happy to share this with you when I'm done. But these are, again, I think a thing to look at, the fact that Trump, even something like Texas, right, with Trump only up an average of 4 points in Texas, some polls show it even with Biden. That said, that's telling a fundamentally different story than what we saw in 2016. And even if you even if you assume that polls are off the same way as they were in 2016, you're still seeing a Biden victory in a lot of these key swing states. So it looks like if the polls are off, that there's a chance that Biden could win Florida. And if Biden wins Florida, that is basically game over in terms of electoral college map. And I told you I would keep it short. I wanted to, and I really want to answer your questions. So please, I would love to, I hope that was short and to the point, and I would love to be able to, can you guys not hear me? I feel now
No, we can hear you.
There's a couple people that said okay.
There are computers.
Okay.
So now we're turning it over to Mara for questions, some of which she already has, but please feel free to add some in the chat.
Okay, well, that was a great, thank you, Mileah. That was a great introduction. And obviously we were top of the list was what did happen in 2016. So, and no one had thought to ask about 2018. So we fall right with all those other audiences. You talked about young adults being hard to reach. And as we know, very often they don't have landlines, they only have cell phones but are there other hidden audiences that pollsters are trying to get at? And could you talk about those and how do you account for those in the polling?
Okay, and so I think what you're referring to is this whole mythological shy Trump voter. So you hear this a lot, right? That the polls are off because we're systematically underestimating or not counting supporters of the president who don't want to tell because of some sort of social desirability bias, don't want to express their opinion to a pollster. And they examined this in 2016. I say Pew Research Center examined this, and APOR, which is the American Association for Public Opinion Research, our large sort of governing body of pollsters, if you will. And they compared telephone surveys versus online surveys, and there should be no social desirability bias on an online survey. It's not as if you and I are having a conversation, you're just clicking on the screen. And there is no real evidence that this was actually happening. And I think it's one of these things that's very confusing for pollsters when you hear about the shy Trumper, because it certainly doesn't seem like the supporters of the president are shy about their support for the president. There's boat parades and signs everywhere, and there's some things that just don't seem to compute there. But there are parts of the electorate that are more difficult to reach via phone than others. Young people were certainly one of them, and there has been some bias towards lower income Americans that don't have the same sort of high response rates as higher income Americans. So there is that possibility for that to happen. I will say that why taking the census, I think it's closed now. The reason taking the census is so important for pollsters is because the census actually gives us appropriate population parameters. So we can use weighting on the back end of a survey to make sure that we're giving the appropriate demographics, the appropriate voice in the survey at the very, very end. So I hope that everybody did their census. It's very, very important.
Yeah, one thing I thought you might have mentioned and you didn't, so maybe it isn't a problem, I was thinking about racial and ethnic groups, are the polls heavily, I often wonder about that. Are they really picking up enough Black voters, enough Hispanic voters, Asian voters, or is that being weighted for? Could you address that?
It's typically, no, the answer is yes, we are, particularly in the areas. I mean, so Maryland, we have no problem. I pull Maryland. Maryland's one of the most racially diverse states in the country, particularly in terms of our percentage of African-American Marylanders. And so we have no problem when we do our dual frame phone calls. We use heavy cell. Most of our sample is cell phone. We use now very little landline. And I would tell you that's one of the major myths about public opinion polling. I hear this every time I release a survey, that somebody says that, oh, they only called landlines. It cannot be farther from the truth. Almost every single reputable polling firm, particularly those of us who are doing public polling for media organizations or just the stuff that the polls that you see in the news, they're heavy cell by this point. Ours is up to 80% plus cell phone. And we're only calling just a fraction, very small landlines. And you're seeing that across the country. But you're right. We do sometimes do some post survey weighting at the very, very end to correct for if we have any imbalance in terms of what the population should look like versus what our sample looks like. You can correct for it with weighting, but I have not, and I know that the pollsters who are in areas like Nevada, like Florida, like Texas and California that have a high Hispanic Latino population, they're doing Spanish language interviews as well. So we don't have to do that in Maryland just yet. We don't have a high enough proportion of our population that's Spanish only. But if I was polling in Texas, I certainly would do that. And so yes, it's always a concern. But pollsters certainly, I think, are able to capture that. And I will say this to everybody, you should always 100% check the demographics of any survey that you are trying, before you believe the results, look at their demographics. They should provide, first of all, they should provide it for you. We do, absolutely. So make sure it looks like the population of interest. So it would be weird for the Goucher poll of Maryland to have 8% African Americans. That would be completely off. I mean, it's around 30% for Maryland. So take a look at the demographics of the state to make sure that things look right. And any good pollster will provide that information for you.
Great. One thing we have a question about, and I want to add something on top of it that I'm wondering about, is you talked about the percentage of undecideds, and I think you even said that it was somewhat high in 2016. So I guess the question is, what is the percentage this time? And I heard somebody on the radio, I didn't catch his name, who was a pollster a couple of weeks ago, saying that it was unusually low this year. Can you speak to that as well? Is it unusually low? It's in the low single digits this year. And so it was in the double digits, even going into the waning weeks of the election in 2016. And now it's down. I think I saw a recent national poll, it was down to 3%. And I think that people who pay close attention to politics always ask themselves, who are these 3%? Like, it's very clear. These are two very, very different candidates with different visions for the country. And so, yeah, you have this 3%. And, listen, the election will be determined by, a handful of voters and a handful of states, like it always is. So that even at 3%, it still matters, and it could matter, particularly in some areas. But there's not the same amount of wiggle room as there was back in 2016. The picture looks a little bit clearer, but again, I think that almost all of us, or almost everybody, I think, that looked at 2016 and really did think, I'm talking about Trump supporters as well as Clinton supporters, really were surprised by the outcome. And so I don't think there's anybody I've talked to, from the political class down to the regular voter, who is certain. Even though I think the polls are painting a very accurate picture of what's happening, there's still the yes, but that everybody seems to default to right now, myself included. So this year, of course, we have an unusually high amount of early voting, people physically going to the polls in probably larger numbers, plus many people, like I did absentee ballot and have already, sent it in my case, several weeks ago, as many of us have. So can you speak to how that, with so many people voting, millions of people have already voted, how does that affect the polling? Because of course we don't know how they voted. Those numbers haven't been released yet.
Sure. So what pollsters do is, so typically how we identify voters is there's a couple different screens. We call them likely voter screens, where you ask if they voted in the previous election. We ask how interested they are in the election, how close attention they pay to politics. So these typical screeners to identify somebody who really is likely to vote. Now, what pollsters have started to do in each of these individual states is now they ask people if they've already voted. So they add an additional question in to identify folks who have already voted. And they're still going to ask those people the same questions, like who did you vote for? What was your most important issue? All these different things. But it's just an adjustment to the questionnaire to make sure that it's still applicable to everybody, including folks like you who've already voted and a person who perhaps is waiting till election day. What's fascinating, I think, about this whole divide between sort of mail-in ballots and election day, and this is something I think we should all pay close attention to, is that partisan divide. So our poll in Maryland, as well as many other polls in different states, suggest that there's just a huge partisan division. Republicans are more likely to say they want to vote on election day or in person in general, versus Democrats, who have been more likely to embrace mail-in voting or even either dropping it in your mailbox or dropping it at a drop box. And so this obviously has some consequences for our ability to know who won the election on election night. Just to be clear, though, we never actually. They're always projections on election night. The final count doesn't happen, and you guys know this. You're all expert. You're the League of Women Voters, for goodness sake. They do the final count in the coming days. But so I would caution people to that it's going to be a while. It's going to be a couple days, I think, especially if it becomes really tight in some of these swing states, particularly in those states that don't start counting the ballots right away. So Maryland's great. Maryland's already started to count. We're going to be able to release results the day of, but it's, the other states that have the laws that you can't start counting until the election closes, then we're going to, unfortunately, we're going to have to wait for that count to happen.
Right. Another question that I got ahead of time, which I never thought about before, it's a great question. Polls are being announced all the time. And does the actual announcement of those polls end up influencing some voters? Yeah, people who are strongly for Trump or strongly for Biden aren't going to be influenced by the poll, but there's got to be people in the middle.
Sure. And so I guess the fundamental question then is, does that mean so that you want to be on the winning team? So that would be like, is there an influence of being on the winning team? Like, so if you see a poll that puts Trump ahead in your state, does that tell you that you want to perhaps be on that team and vote for him? I don't know. I don't know how much that actually would make a difference. There is, certainly people get frustrated this complaint I hear about public opinion polling is that public opinion polling and polls sort of create this media narrative, and that which drives the sort of conversation. My pushback to it always is what would election analysis look like in a world without polls? If we didn't have a scientific understanding of where the everyday voter was at, who gets to decide who's up or who's down? Does rally size then become a proximity for actual vote support? And that's a non-random sample. That to me is just the most fervent supporters together in one place. That's not a real indicator for enthusiasm for me. But that's the question. So I think there's some room to criticize public opinion polling. Maybe the media does a little bit too much follow the polls. But in the world without polls, we have a situation where the everyday voter doesn't even get a chance to be really the main part of the narrative of the momentum of any of the campaigns. The campaigns then decide, and it's the voters who should be deciding who's up, who's up and who's up and who's down.
So, I have a couple of calls here that have come in, and a couple questions, excuse me, about cell phones, which you really explained, and I don't think any of us realized how high the percentage of mobile phone polling is. So one question is, how do you actually get those phone numbers? And the other is, what percentage of people actually answer their phones? And I guess this would apply to landlines as well. And the questioner says, personally, I do not answer my phone if I do not recognize the phone number. So
sure.
You could speak to both of those.
Yeah, definitely. So listen, that is one of the problems facing pollsters, that we've had a declining response rate. I'm trying to think back. I believe that ours is around 9% at the Goucher Poll, but we do all live interview calling, and we make sure we call from a Maryland number. And so those are a couple of things that pollsters do to try to increase response rate. I get it. If I see an out-of-state number that I've never seen before, I stop and hesitate before I answer. And so one of the things to prevent against that is that even when you're contracting out to call centers, they need to be calling from at least a Maryland area code. So live interviews help. So if you have professionally trained live interviewers, they're better at getting you to say yes to take the survey. If you have a friendly voice on the other end of the line, that conversion rate's a lot higher. And listen, one of the biggest problems pollsters have, and it's something that drives us crazy, is the amount of spoof calling. Because we know that when you're, once you get, I must have got in the last week, it seems like it's ticked up, a phone call from a random number talking about a warranty for my car that I don't own. And it's, these are types of things that are really frustrating, because when a legitimate call like a public opinion poll goes through, you can have people silence it. And so, right, that's something that pollsters have had to deal with. And that's where you're starting to see this shift now from the regular phone call. You're seeing a push towards doing more online surveys. And so we have these companies like, for example, YouGov is a really great example. If you are somebody who is dying to be polled, like if your complaint is not that people that you get too many phone calls and you don't want to answer your cell phone, if your complaint is like, man, I wish I could share my opinion, you should go to YouGov and sign up to be part of their panel. And I promise you, they will email you a survey for you to take. A lot of surveys. I'm part of their panel. I take it all the time. So that's exactly, that's my answer is yes, there's a declining response rate. Spoofing calls has made it difficult for us. Live interviewer phone calls are still effective, but we're moving toward having more online probability-based samples. And again, you should sign up. It's really like they do work now. YouGov does for like CBS polls. It's really good. It's really interesting stuff.
So there's so many polls, it's hard to know which ones to really pay attention to. And so one of your viewers wants to know, what specific polls should we be paying attention to? Or could have to do with who took them or where they're published?
Yes, so there is a variety of quality of different polls. So my first thing to tell you, the thing that I always look for when I start to look at like whether I should believe, quote unquote, the poll, I look for the sponsor. Who sponsored this poll? So polls are expensive. Like we're talking about a national survey of 1,200 voters is going to cost an organization upwards of $50,000. So ask yourself, why would somebody want to pay for this? And so it makes sense that like CBS or the New York Times or these large sort of polling organizations that are partnered with media orgs, like why they're doing it. This is part of their sort of their election coverage. It helps inform the public and those types of things. But even sort of polls of like individual states, just check who the sponsor is first. If it's a university like ours, so Goucher College, Monmouth University, Marist College, Franklin and Marshall in Pennsylvania does a poll of Pennsylvania residents that's really well respected. I don't have an agenda. I'm interested in just like the League of Women Voters. Like, I want to be part of the improve public discourse, make sure that that we can be sort of part of this larger sort of political conversation in a neutral, non-biased way. Other organizations, particularly if you see a poll that's sponsored by a candidate, they're only going to share with you those internal polls if it tells a good story about their candidate. So always take those with a grain of salt. And if you see a poll that is sponsored by an organization, it doesn't mean that poll is bad. So for example, if an environmental policy, I have a side business called Federal Hill Research Group. And if I would do, I mean, I'm a reputable pollster, I know what I'm doing. If an organization paid me to do a poll, and then they release the results, you know, these are still a reputable pollster did the work. And so it's not that I think that you should be discounting sort of sponsored polls. I just think you should consider who sponsored it and ask yourself why. Why did they sponsor it? Why did they put out this information?
So going back to, you know, whether polling results influence voters, we have a question I just saw, which is, does it encourage donors? So for instance, she gives the person who's asking the question says specifically refers to congressional races, but I think it really could apply to any, I mean, it could be a mayoral race. It really could apply, I think, to any race. Is that part of the result of either donations go up or go down?
Yes, and so that is the part of the process that always makes me cringe a little bit. And I'm being completely honest, somebody who does we're an endowment funded poll from Goucher College. We're not associated with any candidate or political party. And I know that, you know, when you put out a poll and you show somebody up by a significant amount, that it can influence whether somebody is viewed as a viable challenger. And that can certainly influence the amount of donations that they get. But I would say that that's not on the pollster, that's on the campaign. So it's the campaign's job, not the public pollster's job, to make sure the candidate is viable. But yes, but yes, it can influence. I think that if it's demonstrated in the public that your campaign is not viable by several reputable pollsters, it can cause a problem for your fundraising efforts. But that is a candidate problem, not a pollster problem.
To go back to cell phones, we have a question about, of course, you spoke to the fact that you would use only Maryland numbers to poll people in Maryland, but some people are like me, and we got our cell phone numbers in another state and we kept them. So it looks like I live somewhere else, which might explain why I don't get any calls for polls about Maryland. Well, I mean, how do you account for that? Because I think it's actually a very common phenomenon now that people just keep their cell phone numbers as they move from state to state.
It is. And matter of fact, I also have an out-of-state number, but my billing address is here in Maryland, and so is yours. And so when we purchase our cell phone numbers, just to be clear, I don't sit with an Excel sheet and randomly generate numbers. We purchase from a company that exclusively does this for their business, that generates random samples of cell phone and landline numbers, and they do it by billing address. So they associate the number with your billing address, not with the area code, because of folks like you and I.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thanks. So let's move away from the current polling now. We've had a couple of questions that are more about polling in general. And one thing I'm curious about is, when did these, I mean, I don't remember polling from when I was a kid ever hearing about it. So, I mean, I can sort of vaguely remember people calling and my mother talking about like products, but I don't think they were doing election polling. So can you kind of talk about when that got going and how it got, at what point it got more important?
Oh God, you know what? Now you asked me that, and I was like, when is the? I was just thinking of, like, I'm trying to think of. I actually don't know. That's a great question. When the first sort of Gallup poll and everything, I think it really started to take take hold in like when all households got phones. So I think it's like the 50s and beyond, right? When the Gallup organization started, and everybody having a home phone was something that every single person had. And that's the reason, by the way, that's the reason polling works. And that's the reason what we're doing now, the cell phones and landlines work, because nearly every American has a cell phone or a landline. Matter of fact, a lot of folks have both, but they primarily now just use their cell phone. So that's the reason random sampling works, because everybody has an equal probability of being selected into the sample. And so that I can say with confidence, right, with 95% with a 95% confidence interval, that when I call 800 randomly selected Marylanders, I know the results plus or minus 3.5%, and that's just because of this. That's just basic sampling methodology. And so, right, so we started so every household in the 50s and 60s, they had a landline phone, and so we were able to actually call those folks, take a random sample, and call them. We were really worried. Pollsters were. There was a moment of panic when the number of cell phone numbers sort of ticked up, and people had those dual frame households, because you've basically allowed yourself to be sampled in twice if you had a cell phone and a landline, which messes up the probability. But it turned out that people very quickly went from, even the folks who had a dual frame, went very quickly to being like, that's just the landline is the number we don't even answer. It just comes with a bundle, and we have our cell phone that we actually use. So I think a lot of you probably even at home have the bundle phone, that you get a free landline with cable and you never answer that thing.
Yeah. So switching to a different topic, someone asked, how much difference is there typically in polls, I think she means poll results today, versus 3 or 4 days from now? So we're getting kind of very close to the election, but we still have, nearly a week. And the second part of the question, do the polls consider the error rates on mail-in votes and ballots not counted? So they're kind of two separate questions.
Yeah, so no, listen, polls obviously cannot account for the fact that you said you were definitely going to vote and you definitely did vote, and they rejected, and then they went ahead and rejected your ballot. Like that's not something a poll can account for. And if it's happening, by the way, at a large scale level, that it is creating like that large of a shift in the results, yeah, I mean that's a problem. That's a voter suppression problem. That's an election administrative problem. That's not so much a polling problem, because you can't. The assumption with polls is, right, that you're going to tell me you're going to vote, right? I'm going to screen you into and identify you as a likely voter, and you're going to tell me you're going to vote, and then you're going to cast your ballot. We definitely don't build in like the chance that they're going to reject you, because that should not be the case. And like they should not be rejecting ballots large scale. So that's a really good question. It's obviously something that people should be concerned about, especially in this election, when you do have the recent court case in Wisconsin that said that if they receive now any ballots received after election day, even those who are dated postmarked on election day won't count. So yeah, you're right. That can be a problem. So anybody out there should be setting if they have a mail-in ballot in their hand right now, we should drop it off at one of the drop boxes. Don't put it in the mail.
Right. Yeah, we've had several questions here asking about voter suppression and whether that's factored into the polls. So for instance, let's just assume in some jurisdiction, I don't think this isn't true in Maryland, that 5%, something happens and 5% of the ballots don't count. Is that accounted for in any way in the polls, the possibility?
No, I mean, I don't even know how, no, from the best of my knowledge, no, it's not. And you could certainly make some assumptions. You could do some weighting to make some assumptions. So if you think a certain demographic is more likely to have their vote suppressed than others, you could, I think make some changes on the back end in terms of your weighting schema. But no, I wouldn't say that polls are making those sort of because nobody expects their ballot to be rejected. And by the way, I do want to point out that Susan, thanks to Wikipedia, she looked it up, that 1963 was, and I should have remembered this. She said there was a poll for FDR by Gallup in 1936. And I think, sorry if I was confused by I was not clear with my question. Thank you, Susan. That I was trying to think about like the media coverage, like when did we get so like obsessed with like the horse race polling media coverage? I don't think the 90s, the 90s is when this really started taking off as something that's sort of very like dominated. Like you had these talking heads that became like polling experts and wonks all over the cable television. And I think that obviously coincides with the rise of the 24-hour news networks. Polls became this really great thing to sort of talk about. But I'm sorry if I was confused or didn't answer that question appropriately. And thank you, Susan, for looking it up for me.
Thank you, because I was sort of racking my brains, and it's interesting that it ties with the phenomenon of the huge uptick in upswing in media in general. They need stuff. They need stuff to talk about. We had a question, which I've now lost. Hold on a second. How much influence on selecting the polling audience does the group paying for the poll have?
Listen, it all depends on what they're trying to do, right? So like the goal for a media poll, so if I would partner with the New York Times, or if I would partner with the Baltimore Sun, which would make more sense, right? If I would partner with the Baltimore Sun to do a poll, or even a regular Goucher poll, so my audience is going to be, my target audience is Marylanders, so Maryland voters, the question always drives the method in political science. So what it is that you want to know. So I want to know what women think. Well, then my audience would be just female voters, or I want to know what men think, or I want to know what African Americans think. You can select obviously by those demographics on who you poll, but these organizations that are doing media polling that you're consuming on a daily basis, they're trying to identify as close as they possibly can likely voters, either registered voters, and then as we get closer to the election, they refine that by likely voters, and so that's the audience. Now every pollster makes different choices on how they identify likely voters. There's a bunch of different screens that people use. Some people choose to call off what we call like a registration-based sampling, where they call off the voter list. Other people, and this is a choice that I make, they do random digit dialing. So they call the entire adult population, and then they screen down to registered voters, and then use screens to screen down to likely voters. I think I like using RDD, random digit dialing, because I think it captures the full electorate. So it captures new voters, people who you could have just registered, and I would be able to pick you up using RDD. But if you just registered, you wouldn't be on the most recent voter list. And so I could possibly miss you. And sometimes when you register to vote, people aren't that great about putting their cell phone numbers down. You don't have to give your number when you register to vote. And so there are some missing data there's some missing data sometimes when you do registration-based sampling. But really the results, all the research people have done on the two, there really is very little difference in terms of accuracy of the results. It's like every pollster makes a preference on their methodology, and my opinion is as long as they can defend their methodology to the public, and they're doing at least some of the same right things, they're in good company.
So I just want to remind the audience, we still can take questions in the chat function if you have additional questions that we haven't covered yet. And I'm going to ask one that was asked earlier, and then we'll have time for an additional one if anyone has one. So there was a question earlier about Goucher polling in general, which isn't always focused on the election, obviously. Yeah. We don't always have an election going. So what other sorts of things is the Goucher polling working on? Are you waiting until somebody kind of like an environmental group calls you up and said, we'd love to have you do a poll? Or are you sort of initiating polls on different topics that are not election related? So
I will say this, first and foremost, the Goucher poll is a policy poll. So we're a policy poll that dabbles in elections. Listen, I know that we love to talk about the horse race poll. People love to talk about it. I love to talk about it. But frankly, if you really want to know what Americans and Marylanders think, ask their questions about policy, ask them a battery of policy questions, not just who's up or who's down or who they like or who they don't like. You know, ask them what they think about the most important issues facing the state. And that's sort of the bread and butter of the Goucher Poll. Now, we don't do contract work. So if the environmental group would call me and say, Mileah, we'd like to pay you $50,000 to do a poll on the Chesapeake Bay. And I would say, well, thank you. You can come talk to my private business. That would be great. But the Goucher Poll is interested in environmental issues. So I could ask, that's a topic that everybody cares about. So we've asked about the Chesapeake Bay in the past. We asked about health of the Bay. We've asked about environmental issues. And so what I would do is I would come up with a list of questions that I thought really talked to the issues that people cared about in Maryland. And then I would ask, I would put them on the Goucher Poll, and I would never take, we don't take any money from outside sources. So the Goucher Poll, no money from outside sources. And, typically if it's an issue that's on the top of Maryland, like on the front page of the Baltimore Sun, it's an issue that we care about. So like I just asked a battery of questions about COVID on our last poll. That is clearly an issue that Marylanders care about. And police reform. They've had a working group now in the Maryland General Assembly looking at ways to reform the police. And we're going to absolutely ask about those issues. And in our spring poll, we'll put out in February, we're probably going to talk about Kerwin again one more time to see if, depending on whether they override the veto or how they end up handling it, we're going to ask about those issues too. And that, by the way, is the sort of the beauty of having the Goucher Poll in Maryland. It's something I'm really proud of, is it's a resource for us to take a neutral, non-biased look at these issues. And it's policy focused. We do the horse race, I'll definitely do the gubernatorial horse race, but the majority of our stuff, somebody asked here, it's goucher.edu/poll is all of our polling information. You can go back and look. We have 8 years of it now, which is great.
Great. So it looks like you just answered the question I was going to ask. We can access the information if we want to know more detail than the Sun will ever provide us in an article. So thank you very much. Those are all our questions, and I'm going to turn it back over to Judith.
Couldn't find myself there for a minute. So we want to let you know that we really appreciate your being with us today. And I know that I learned a lot, although it was the second time I've heard Dr. Kromer speak, and you gave me a little bit of hope. I just don't know whether to trust elections, and you've restored my faith. So I want to thank you for joining us again. And I want to encourage you once again to join your local League of Women Voters. And I think we were going to get information put up again, but if we don't, that's all right. And finally, I hope that you will join us on November 10th, when our next speaker will be Dr. Martha Jones. Dr. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and a Professor of History at the Johns Hopkins University. She is a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. Dr. Jones' presentation on the 10th is entitled Vanguard: How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Fought for the Rights of All. We hope that you're going to be able to join us. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Any other questions? I think you see Dr. Kromer's email if you have other questions, and we hope we'll see you on the 10th. And you see the registration in the Zoom, and feel free to pass it on. It's free. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.